You are not lost in life. You are simply disconnected from your monad. While you identify with the ego, the monad watches in silence, waiting for you to stop running. If you are here, it is because the monad is already touching you, not the mind, not the ego, not emotion. The monad is what existed before the I, before identity, before fragmentation. You do not need to create it or activate it, only to stop moving away. When the noise ceases, even for a moment, the monad recognizes itself. And after that, you feel, no longer as an idea, but as presence, that something essential has always been there, waiting for you to stop. In true Hermeticism, the monad is not the I, not the personality, not the thinking mind, not the social character you defend every day. The monad is the one principle, indivisible, prior to any form, what existed before there was a you. In the Corpus Hermeticum, when Hermes Trismegistus describes the nous, the divine mind, he points to something above ordinary thought, an intelligence that does not argue, imagine, or fantasize. It is at this level that the monad participates. And now I ask you, with brutal honesty, do you live connected to this, or do you live merely reacting as a loose fragment in the world? The problem is that you try to access the monad with the same mind that keeps you trapped, and that is impossible. Hermeticism never taught that the divine is reached by accumulating information. It teaches that recognizes what is chaotic in you does not recognize what is one, what is noisy does not perceive what is silent. That is why the first movement is not to do something external. It is to interrupt identification with the body, with the name, with the story, with the drama. When Hermes speaks of self-knowledge, he is not speaking of psychological self-analysis. He is speaking of remembering what you are before form. Do you remember that? Or do you remember only what wounded you? This night is not about theatrical ritual, it is about inner position. Before sleep, when the external world begins to power down, you must do something almost no one does. Withdraw consent. Withdraw consent to continue being only the ego. It is not to deny the ego, it is to stop feeding it for a few hours. Hermeticism teaches that whatever receives attention receives life. So why do you give your entire attention to the mind, to fear, to anxiety, and then find it strange that you hear nothing deeper? Have you ever asked who observes your thoughts? Do not answer quickly. If you observe them, then you are not them. That silent observer is the doorway. And the monad does not speak with words, it resonates. Here a fundamental Gnostic point enters: forgetfulness. Gnosis teaches that the soul fell into forgetfulness of its origin. It is not sin, it is amnesia. And amnesia is not resolved by effort, it is resolved by remembrance. When you lie down and quiet the body, do not ask for anything, do not plead, do not bargain, simply sustain naked awareness without image, without expectation. This is difficult because the ego panics when it is no longer the center. Do you feel restlessness? Good. That is the ego losing territory. Do you feel emptiness? Better still. Emptiness is the field where the one recognizes itself. In Hermeticism, the principle of mentalism says that all is mind, but not your personal mind. It is the mind of the all. The monad is a spark of this indivisible mind. When you stop defining yourself for a few minutes, something begins to align. It is not a strong emotion, not a spectacular vision. It is a silent adjustment, an inner recognition that needs no applause. Have you ever felt that instant when everything seems strangely simple and obvious, as if you were remembering something ancient? That does not come from outside. It rises from within. Now be honest. Can you remain 5 minutes without seeking stimulation? Without music, without mantra, without image, without the expectation of an experience? Because if you cannot, it is not the monad that is distant, it is you who are addicted to noise. Hermeticism does not promise comfort. It promises truth. And truth at first dismantles. When you sustain this conscious silence before sleep, something begins to cross the threshold between waking and sleep. That is where the monad touches the psychic field, not as a voice, but as direction. You wake up different. You cannot explain it, but you know. And here is the point almost no one accepts. This connection does not happen if you want to use it to inflate the ego to feel special, chosen, or superior. The monad does not serve the character. In Hermeticism, whoever tries to use the divine for personal ends automatically moves away from it. Connection happens when you are willing to be traversed, not to control. Are you willing to that, or do you just want one more spiritual sensation? If tonight you truly do this, not as a technique, but as conscious surrender, something begins. It does not end, it begins. And from then on, everything you think is you starts to be questioned from the inside out. But tell me now, with brutal sincerity, do you really want to remember who you are before the I existed? Or do you just want to hear this as one more beautiful piece of content before falling asleep? If you are hearing this now, it is not by chance. And I am not saying this as cheap mysticism. I am speaking of the monad, the central point, the one and indivisible principle prior to any form. In true Hermeticism, the monad is not the I, not the personality, not the thinking mind, not the feeling body, not the story you keep repeating. The monad is that which existed before any identity existed. It is unity before division. It is the center before fragmentation. And while you live identified with fragments, the monad remains silent, not because it is distant, but because you are dispersed. Do you perceive this, or do you keep running? In the Corpus Hermeticum, when Hermes Trismegistus speaks of the nous, he points to an intelligence that is not discursive, not emotional, not reactive. This nous is not produced by the human mind. It passes through it when there is alignment. The monad participates at this level. It does not debate, argue, or explain. It recognizes. And here comes the surgical question. Do you live connected to the monad, or do you live merely orbiting thoughts, desires, and fears that never stop? Do you feel the monad, or do you only imagine concepts? The fatal mistake is trying to access the monad with the same mind that sustains separation. That has never worked and never will. Hermeticism never taught the accumulation of ideas to reach the one. It taught disidentification, like recognizes like. What is fragmented does not recognize the one. What is noisy does not perceive the silent. What is dispersed does not feel the monad. So the first movement is not to do, it is to stop sustaining the character, to stop sustaining the name, to stop sustaining the narrative. When Hermes speaks of self-knowledge, he speaks of remembering the origin, the monad, not of analyzing traumas. Do you remember the monad, or do you only remember what wounded you? This night is not about spiritual performance. It is about inner position before the monad. When the body slows and the external world loses force, you are given a rare window. And in that window, you must withdraw consent to continue being only the ego. Withdraw consent to continue living apart from the monad. It is not about fighting the ego, it is about not feeding it. Hermeticism is clear. Whatever receives attention receives life. Do you give attention to the monad, or only to the noise? How do you expect to hear the monad if you never become silent? Ask yourself now, without answering quickly. Who observes your thoughts? Who observes your fears? Who observes your fatigue? If you observe, you are not that. This observer is the door. This observer is the threshold. This observer is the point where the monad begins to manifest. The monad does not speak. It resonates. It does not explain. It aligns. And when this alignment begins, something in you recognizes, without words. Gnosis teaches that the soul fell into forgetfulness of its origin. This is forgetting the monad. It is not guilt. It is amnesia. And amnesia is not healed by effort. It is healed by remembrance. When you lie down, do not ask for experiences, do not seek visions, do not create images. Simply sustain naked awareness before the monad, without form, without expectation, without fantasy. This is uncomfortable because the ego panics when it is no longer the center. Do you feel restlessness? That is the ego resisting the monad. Do you feel emptiness? That emptiness is the field where the monad operates. The principle of mentalism teaches that all is mind, but not the personal mind. It is the mind of the all. The monad is the indivisible spark of that mind. When you stop defining yourself even for a few minutes, the monad finds space. It is not a strong emotion. It is not theatrical ecstasy. It is adjustment. It is remembrance. It is as if something extremely ancient were being recognized again. Have you ever felt that absurd, almost disconcerting simplicity, as if everything had always been there? That is the monad touching the psychic field. Now be brutally honest. Can you remain 5 minutes without stimulation, without mantra, without image, without spiritual narrative? Because if you cannot, you are not distant from the monad, you are addicted to distraction. Hermeticism does not promise comfort, it promises truth. And truth dismantles the character. When you sustain conscious silence before sleep, the monad begins to cross the threshold between waking and sleep, not as a voice, but as direction. You wake up different. You cannot explain it, but you know. The monad is not proven, it is recognized. And here is the point almost no one accepts. The monad does not connect to inflate the ego. The monad does not serve the character. Whoever tries to use the monad to feel special automatically moves away from it. In Hermeticism, this is law, not opinion. Connection happens when you accept being traversed, not when you want to control. Do you want the monad, or do you just want an experience to tell? If tonight you truly do this, not as a technique, but as conscious surrender to the monad, something begins to reorganize from the inside out. It does not end. It begins. And from that contact onward, everything you call me begins to be questioned silently. But answer me now, looking directly inward. Do you truly want to remember the monad that you are? Or do you prefer to continue existing as a comfortable fragment, hearing this only as one more piece of content before sleep? When the monad begins to manifest, it does not ask permission from the character you have built. It does not negotiate with your fears, does not respect your excuses, does not wait for you to be ready. The monad is prior to your readiness. It is prior to your doubt. It is even prior to your spiritual search. The discomfort that arises when you sustain this silence is not a sign of error. It is a sign of approach. The ego feels threatened because the monad dissolves boundaries. Do you notice how everything in you wants to flee when the silence becomes too deep? That flight is precisely the point where the monad begins to apply pressure. The monad does not enter your life as something new, it returns as something forgotten. That is why there is no sense of conquest, but of remembrance. You do not feel that you have gained something, you feel that something has fallen into its proper place. And that is frightening because it pulls the ground out from under the narratives you used to survive. The monad does not validate your stories, it passes through them, it does not ask who you were, it points to what you have always been. Are you willing to lose your stories in order to remember the monad? The more you sustain this silent presence, the more you perceive how far you have lived from it. The monad does not accuse, but the contrast hurts. You see how much of your life was guided by reactivity, automatism, conditioning. The monad does not judge, but it exposes. And this exposure is intimate. No one sees it from the outside. It is you with yourself, or rather, you with that which existed before you. And in this meeting, falsehood cannot endure. The mind tries to hijack the experience of the monad. It tries to translate, to name, to classify. But every time you try to understand the monad, you move away from it. The monad is not understood, it is recognized. Hermes never taught that the one is an object of the intellect. The intellect is posterior. The monad is prior. Do you feel the difference between thinking about unity and being in unity? That difference is not subtle. It is absolute. When the monad begins to touch your consciousness, you realize something brutal. Much of your suffering was unnecessary. Not because the pain did not exist, but because identification with it was optional. The monad does not eliminate the human experience, but it removes the shackle of blind identification. You continue living, but something no longer sticks. Drama loses density. Fear loses authority. The monad does not take you out of the world, it takes you out of inner captivity. This is where many retreat, because living connected to the monad demands radical responsibility. There is nowhere left to hide, there is no more them, there is no blind destiny. Hermeticism teaches that to know the principle is to assume the axis, and to assume the axis is to stop outsourcing your own life. The monad does not control you, but it demands coherence. Are you prepared to live aligned, or do you prefer to remain comfortable in misalignment? The presence of the monad is silent, yet it reorganizes everything. Your choices begin to change without effort. Certain things simply no longer fit. Certain people no longer resonate. Certain paths close on their own, not by rejection, but by vibrational incompatibility. The monad does not force cuts. It reveals incongruences, and you feel in the body when something is not aligned. Do you have the courage to listen to that? Or will you continue betraying yourself in order to belong? In the state of contact with the monad, time changes texture. The past loses weight. The future loses anxiety. There is only a dense, living, lucid now. It is not ecstasy. It is presence. It is not escape from the world. It is deep grounding. The monad anchors you in something that does not oscillate. And from that point on, everything that oscillates becomes evident. You begin to see how much you lived reacting to waves instead of remaining at the center. Gnosis has always affirmed that the external world is a reflection of a fragmented internal state. The monad is the antidote to fragmentation. When it manifests, you do not feel the urge to convince anyone, prove anything, or announce anything. There is a firm quietude, a certainty without discourse. That is why true contact with the monad is invisible to external eyes. There is no spectacle. There is alignment, but do not be mistaken. The monad is not emotional anesthesia. On the contrary, it intensifies perception. You feel more, see more, perceive more. The difference is that now you do not lose yourself in what you feel. You pass through it. The monad does not protect you from pain. It prevents you from dissolving into it. And that changes everything, because suffering is no longer identity. It is merely passage. When you sustain this state repeatedly, night after night, something crystallizes, not as rigidity, but as axis. You begin to recognize when you are aligned and when you are not. And this recognition is immediate, visceral. The body knows, the breath knows, the silence knows. The monad becomes an inner reference, not dogma, not belief, a living reference. It is at this point that life begins to test, not to punish, but to verify coherence. Situations arise to see whether you abandon the monad in the face of fear. People appear to see whether you betray yourself to be accepted. Paths appear to see whether you choose external power or inner truth. The monad does not speak, but it observes, and you feel when you move away from it, it is impossible to pretend. The greatest trap is to believe that connection with the monad is permanent without maintenance. It is not. Dispersion is seductive. The world pulls. The ego insists. The monad is not lost, but you can drift away from listening. That is why Hermeticism has always spoken of constant remembrance. Not mechanical ritual, living remembrance. Do you remember the monad throughout the day or only at night when everything falls silent? The more you sustain this contact, the simpler your life becomes. Not easy, simple. Less noise, less excess, less justification. The monad cuts away the superfluous without violence. It does not demand artificial asceticism, it removes what does not resonate. And what remains is essential. You feel when something is essential. You do not need to explain it, you simply know. And then a question arises that cannot be ignored. If the monad was always there, why did you spend so much time away? This question is not meant to generate guilt, it is meant to generate lucidity. Forgetfulness was convenient. Fragmentation allowed anesthesia. The monad demands presence, and presence demands courage. Are you willing to live awake, or do you prefer to keep sleeping with spiritual discourses? When the monad becomes the axis, the search ends, and practice begins. Not ritualistic practice, but existential practice. Every choice becomes a mirror, every gesture becomes a sign, every silence becomes teaching. The monad does not give you ready-made answers, it refines your perception, and refined perception changes everything. You stop asking for paths and begin to recognize them. But here is the critical point: the more you align with the monad, the less you fit into structures based on illusion. And this can generate solitude, not abandonment, lucid solitude. Are you prepared to sustain this difference without trying to diminish yourself in order to fit? The monad does not separate you from the world, it separates you from falsehood. And living without falsehood is rarer than it seems. That is why few sustain this contact, not because of incapacity, but because of lack of willingness. The monad does not demand faith, it demands absolute honesty, and that is frightening. So now, looking inward, feeling the silence between one thought and another, tell me, without answering out loud, if the monad truly begins to manifest fully in your life, what in you will need to die for this to be sustained? When the ego realizes that the monad is taking up space, it reacts with old strategies. It creates urgency, creates fear, creates distraction, creates a spiritual identity. It tries to paint itself as light in order to remain in control. But the monad is not deceived. It does not respond to discourse, it responds to state. And the more you try to appear aligned, the farther away you become. The monad demands inner nakedness, not of clothes, but of masks. Are you willing to be without a mask, even for yourself? The pressure that arises at this point is real. You feel a strange weight in the chest, a nameless restlessness, a sudden urge to do anything to escape that silence. This is not failure. This is the ego trying to reclaim territory. The monad does not fight. It waits. It knows the ego grows tired. And when the ego tires, the silence deepens. It is in this deepening that something shifts definitively within you. The monad does not arrive with answers. It arrives with an axis. And an axis changes everything. Situations that once dominated you emotionally now pass like clouds, not because you have become cold, but because you no longer confuse yourself with them. The monad does not harden, it centers. And centering is freedom. Do you perceive the difference between controlling emotions and not being possessed by them? The more this axis establishes itself, the more you realize how much of your life was lived in reactivity. You responded to stimuli, expectations, inherited fears. The monad does not react, it emanates, and living from emanation is radically different. You act because you are coherent, not because you are pressured. This changes your posture, your speech, your gaze. People feel it, even if they do not understand. In this state, solitude appears differently, not as abandonment, but as a natural distancing from noise. Empty conversations exhaust, chaotic environments drain, not out of arrogance, but incompatibility. The monad adjusts your sensitivity. An adjusted sensitivity does not tolerate excess. You begin to choose silence effortlessly. And this unsettles those who live on noise. The monad also exposes your incoherence. Not with guilt, but with clarity. You notice when you say something you do not feel. When you promise something you will not fulfill. When you betray yourself to be accepted. This perception hurts at first. But this pain is liberating. Because now you know. And knowing removes excuse. The monad does not condemn you, it makes you responsible. There comes a moment when you realize you cannot go back. Not because something bound you, but because something became clear. You may even pretend, but you no longer believe your own lie. The monad breaks the spell, and living without false enchantment is uncomfortable at first. You lose illusions that gave you anesthesia, but you gain lucidity, and lucidity is irreversible. Over time, fear changes shape. You stop fearing the loss of external things and begin to fear drifting away from the axis. not paralyzing fear, lucid fear, a deep respect for your own integrity. The monad becomes a silent reference. When something pulls you out of that axis, the body signals it, the breath changes, the silence weighs, you learn to listen. The mind tries to negotiate. It says you can access the monad only sometimes when it is convenient. But the monad is not an event. It is a state. Not something you visit, but something you sustain. And sustaining requires inner vigilance. Not tension, vigilance. Continuous presence. You begin to notice when you are absent from yourself. And that noticing itself is already a return. Gradually, the notion of spiritual seeking loses meaning. Not because you have arrived somewhere, but because you realize you were always at the center and insisted on orbiting around it. The monad is not a destination. It is an origin. And when the origin is remembered, movement changes. You no longer chase experiences, you deepen the state. In this deepening, psychological time begins to dissolve. The past loses emotional power. The future loses anxiety. The now becomes dense, almost palpable. Not euphoria, presence. The monad anchors you in this now. And in this now, you realize how much energy you wasted living outside yourself. Communication changes. You speak less, but when you speak, there is weight. Not aggressive weight, real weight. Words come from the axis, not from reaction. And this unsettles people, because those who live fragmented feel alignment as a threat. You stop trying to be understood by everyone. The monad does not seek approval. There are days when the contact feels weaker, not because the monad left, but because you dispersed. And this dispersion is now perceived. Before it was normal. Now it is evident. This creates a productive discomfort. You return to silence not out of obligation, but out of inner necessity. The monad becomes home. Over time, you notice that many decisions that once required effort now resolve themselves. Not because you became passive, but because alignment eliminates false options. What is not coherent simply does not sustain itself. The monad simplifies without impoverishing. It removes excess and preserves the essential. The greatest proof of contact with the monad is not what you feel in silence, but how you act in conflict. That is where everything is tested. When pressured, do you return to the axis or react as before? When provoked, do you lose yourself or remain present? The monad does not exempt you from the world. It asks for coherence within the world. There comes a point when you realize you can no longer live divided. You can no longer be one thing in silence and another in daily life. This division becomes unbearable. The monad demands integration, and integration hurts because it kills characters. Are you willing to let die what gave you identity for so long? When this integration begins, life does not become perfect, but it becomes true. And truth demands daily courage. Not heroic courage, silent courage. The courage not to lie to yourself. The courage to sustain the axis even when no one sees. The monad does not need witnesses. And then a question arises that returns again and again in deeper layers. If you truly live from the monad, what in your current life cannot continue to exist in the same way? Do not answer with the mind. Feel it in the body. The answer is already there. When spirituality becomes a tool of the ego, the monad withdraws into silence. Not as punishment, but as an impossibility of contact. The ego wants to use the language of the sacred to maintain power, status, control, identity. It wants to appear awakened without dying. But the monad does not negotiate with appearances. It does not respond to empty symbols, well-crafted discourses, or inner performances. It responds only to naked truth, and naked truth hurts. Do you feel when you are using spirituality as anesthesia? At this point, many confuse calm with alignment. They confuse the absence of external conflict with contact with the monad, but the monad is not an emotional tranquilizer. It is an ontological axis. It does not serve to make you feel better. It serves to make you whole. Sometimes that increases discomfort because what was hidden comes to the surface. The monad illuminates and light reveals. Do you prefer artificial peace or real lucidity? When the ego realizes it has lost direct control, it tries something more sophisticated. It creates the identity of the observer. It says, I am not the ego, yet it still is. The monad passes through this trap easily because there is still someone wanting to position themselves above. The monad is not above, it is before. Before the observer, before thought, before choice. Can you perceive this prior point without trying to appropriate it? As this deepening unfolds, silence changes its quality. It is no longer the absence of noise, it is dense presence. A silence that sustains. A silence that observes without separating. You begin to feel that something in you remains unmoving while everything moves. Emotions pass, thoughts pass, sensations pass. But something does not pass. This is not a concept, it is direct experience. The monad begins to reveal itself as permanence. From there, life starts to reorganize without warning, not because you planned it, but because what is misaligned can no longer sustain itself. Certain choices simply lose energy. Certain emotional addictions dry up. Certain compulsions lose their taste, not out of morality, but lack of resonance. The monad does not fight habits, it removes the fuel, and without fuel, the habit dies on its own. You begin to notice how much you lived asking permission to exist, permission to feel, to choose to be. The monad does not ask permission, it is. And when you align with it, something in you stops apologizing for existing. This does not become arrogance, it becomes silent firmness. A firmness that needs no explanation. People feel it, even if they do not know why. In this state, fear changes its root. It is no longer fear of making mistakes, of losing, of failing. A deeper fear arises, the fear of moving away from yourself. Not as guilt, but as alertness. You feel when something pulls you off the axis, and that sensation is immediate. The monad becomes an inner compass, and ignoring that compass begins to hurt more than facing the world. The world, by the way, does not become simpler, it becomes clearer. You see power games, subtle manipulations, social lies with uncomfortable clarity, not to judge but not to get lost. The monad does not make you naive, it makes you lucid. And lucidity can isolate because not everyone wants to see. Are you willing to sustain this lucidity without closing yourself off? Communication changes again. You begin to speak only when necessary. Excess words feel like waste. Silence gains value, not as escape, but as respect. The monad teaches economy of energy. You learn where presence is worth investing and where it is not. This does not make you cold, it makes you precise. And precision is rare. There are moments when the old you tries to return. Old impulses, old patterns, old reactions appear like ghosts, not to dominate you, but to be seen in the light of the monad. They no longer have the same force, but they still ask for recognition. You do not fight, you observe. And by observing without identification, they dissolve. The monad integrates without repression. The body begins to participate in this alignment. The breath changes, the posture changes, the gaze changes, not through technique, but through inner coherence. The body recognizes when it no longer needs to sustain unnecessary tension. The monad is not just an idea, it is a principle that manifests in matter. Hermeticism has always taught this. Spirit and matter are not opposites, they are degrees. At this point, sleep changes, dreams change, not necessarily becoming more vivid, but clearer, less chaotic, more symbolic. The mind begins to reorganize around the axis. The monad influences even the unconscious, not by controlling it, but by ordering it. Order not as rigidity, but as functional harmony. You begin to realize that many old pains were tied to trying to be something you were not. The monad dissolves that attempt, not by telling you who you should be, but by removing what you are not, and what remains is simple, almost obvious. So obvious that you wonder how you did not see it before. The answer is simple. You were far from the center. Practical life begins to reflect this. Work changes in meaning, not necessarily externally, but in intention. You begin to act from coherence, not from lack. Relationships based on dependency begin to crumble. Relationships based on truth deepen. The monad does not improve false relationships, it exposes them. There comes a moment when you realize you are no longer seeking the monad, you are returning to it repeatedly. And return is different from seeking. Seeking presupposes distance, return presupposes origin. Each time you disperse, something in you knows how to come back. That is spiritual maturity, not perfection maturity. The temptation now is to teach, to convince, to awaken others. But the monad is not in a hurry. It does not demand an external mission, it demands inner fidelity. And when that fidelity is real, it overflows naturally, without propaganda, without discourse, without urgency. Alignment speaks for itself. The more you sustain this, the more you realize that the true practice is not to meditate more, study more, accumulate more symbols. It is not to betray yourself. It is not to abandon the axis for convenience. It is not to fragment out of fear. This is harder than any ritual, and that is why few sustain it. The monad does not promise future salvation. It demands presence now, not tomorrow, not when everything is resolved, now. In the body you have, in the life you live, in the chaos that exists. It does not take you out of the world, it anchors you in it without losing yourself. And then, at unexpected moments, an even deeper silence arises. Not sought, not induced, it simply happens. And in that silence there is no question, no doubt, no need to understand. There is only recognition. The monad recognizes itself in you. But now, before continuing, let this question pass through you without verbal answer. If the monad becomes the real axis of your life, what do you know deep down that you will no longer be able to pretend to be? If something in you recognized all of this without needing to understand, do not ignore it. That recognition is the sign. Subscribe to the channel now to continue this deepening without diluting real Hermeticism. Activate the bell so you don't miss the next videos where the process is taken even deeper, and leave your comment, not to prove anything, but to mark your conscious presence here.